Hi everyone, and thanks for letting me join you this morning at the virtual conference. And in these very odd times, thanks very much for letting me record this message to you. I'm afraid I can't join you live. And what a difference a year makes. It was just a year ago that I stood on the platform at the All Energy Conference, just a few days after we'd published our advice to government on net zero. And in that advice, we spelled out the need to set a new goal for cutting emissions to net zero in the UK. And we also set out the steps necessary to get there. And this had been the year when we were going to see momentum, I hope, towards the actions that would deliver that goal overall. This was a very big year, culminating, of course, in the plan to have the next big climate summit in Glasgow, the COP26. And I'm sitting here in Glasgow recording this message to you today, and of course everything has changed. It is now all about COVID and what lies ahead. So what I'd like to try and do today is to talk about net zero, but also to talk about achieving net zero in the midst of the coronavirus and the steps that will follow. And try and give some sense of why I think that is still the right target and how we can make sure that the steps that lie ahead get us on track. So let's start, and I think it's useful to divide up the future into the short, the medium and the long term, and I'll do that if I can in reverse order and start with the long term. And the irony is that despite the enormous changes that we've seen in economic activity and with greenhouse gas emissions with it in the recent weeks, the long term hasn't changed at all. So when it comes to the climate, we face the same problems that we did just a few weeks ago. It is true that emissions have dropped like a stone in recent weeks, and it is true that this year we will probably see the biggest ever fall in greenhouse gas emissions globally. But the climate hasn't really blinked, so we are still adding carbon dioxide to our atmosphere. We are still going to need to tackle that. At present levels, we are probably at a level of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere we haven't had for 2 or 3 million years. And 2 or 3 million years ago, we had seas that were 20 meters higher than they are now. So we still need to act on that. And the scientific goal is still to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. That's the point at which we will stop warming the planet globally. And therefore, we still have this enduring mission here in the UK to cut emissions in every sector to the point where we can get to net zero by 2050 at the latest. That means zero carbon transport, that means zero carbon energy provision, that means changing the way we use land and agriculture on that land, and changes in the way that we have industry take place in the UK so we can cut emissions there, and changes in the home so that we have a more energy efficient way of living in our homes and a lower carbon way of heating them. Those issues remain. They haven't really changed, but of course COVID and the post-coronavirus economy changes utterly the context for how we will get there. So we need to think about what will happen in the short and the medium term, and I think this is probably where the most interesting questions lie. So in the medium term, and by that I mean over the next 10 or 15 years, there are still lots and lots of questions about what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen with the oil price. We don't know what's going to happen with how behaviours might change after this lockdown. Might we move more easily to remote working and travelling less? Might we have to do that? Might we see bigger changes in industry and the composition of the economy happening more quickly perhaps than we thought? And some other slightly more sobering things. Might there be less capital available for investment? And can we focus what capital there is available on the right things so that we cut emissions overall? Overall, these are big questions for the medium term that this year the Committee on Climate Change are going to try and throw some light on. But as we speak today, it's still not clear exactly where we sit with all of that. It's really in the short term that for me the most interesting questions and priorities are now becoming clear. And you may know that we wrote recently to the Prime Minister and to the First Ministers of all of the UK nations to give our advice on how to shape up the steps necessary in the short term to get us on track for net zero, but also to recover the economy and to make sure that the economy is more resilient to the effects of climate change in the future. So I want to run through some of that with you in the second half of this talk to you this morning. So firstly, on investment, our clear message to the government is let's drive the economic recovery, let's drive the need for new jobs and the creation of those jobs by making climate investments. That means investments in those things that reduce emissions, also investments in those things that will help us manage climate change itself. We know the things that we need to invest in to cut our emissions. We set all of that out last year, and the government were listening, and there was a real momentum towards building a plan to meet the net zero goal. So let's use that as a way to get prepared and to respond to the recession that we're in at the moment. That means investing in things like energy efficient homes, investing in electric vehicle charging, investing in renewable energy. These investments are sensible, they'll create new jobs, they're spread right across the UK, and they have multiple benefits. So with those investments come better air quality, even improvements in health. So it makes a great deal of sense for the government to bring forward those investments as quickly as they can. Secondly, positive behaviours coming out of this. Let's try and encourage those positive changes in the way that we live our life, some of which we've had a glimpse of during the lockdown, as a means to cut emissions, but also as a means to get the economy going. The lockdown and the measures necessary for the lockdown are not a prescription in any way for tackling climate change, but they have given us a glimpse of what it would be like in a world where we were not burning fossil fuels, particularly in our cities. We've all experienced cleaner air, those of you who've had the experience in cities. We've come to value our green spaces more and more. So some of the things we've experienced, we might wish to encourage more as social distancing becomes a memory. That means remote working potentially becoming less of a scary thing for us and reducing our business travel needs. We've even done things like remote medical consultations and moved so swiftly to that being the norm as well. These steps, if we stick with some of them, can help us tackle climate change and make lives better. So let's think again about investment plans, particularly for things like roads. Imagine if we spent a little less on roads and road transport and a little bit more on cycle provision and broadband provision coming out of this. That would seem a really good, sensible step to make in the midst of this crisis. Thirdly, let's avoid locking in the use of greenhouse gases, so ensuring that the recovery doesn't lock in our use of fossil fuels and instead locks in those cleaner alternatives overall. The government has done remarkable things in the middle of this crisis to protect jobs and industries. They may need to do remarkable things as we come out of it too. So let's learn the lessons of previous recessions. Let's not lock in our use of fossil fuels by making those fuels cheaper, for example, or by investing in high carbon industries. Let's flip it round and invest in low emissions. Let's invest in renewable energy. Let's invest in more energy efficient homes. Let's talk more about electric vehicles and how we can hasten that transition too. And if the time comes for bailouts, then the governments can consider what strings it might attach to improve over time industrial decarbonisation too for those industries it supports. This can be a really important and useful moment for us to reset the path of emissions towards a lower carbon future. Fourthly, and related to that, are tax changes and getting the tax policies right as we come out of this, so we create the right incentives for decarbonisation whilst getting the economy ticking as well. We already knew that tax changes were on the cards. We need to think more of how we can change that tax framework that we have in the UK to tax high carbon and encourage low carbon. And it can be a really good moment to sort out the public finances as we think about the need to do that and think about taxing carbon more, particularly when at the moment fossil fuel prices are rock bottom, so the consumer needn't notice. That can be a hugely important step in again, addressing the profile and trajectory of emissions in the UK in the future. And lastly, the issue of fairness. Let's make sure the recovery is fair. We already knew that the steps towards net zero we're going to bring into the frame the question of how we manage fairness across the economy, protecting those consumers who can least afford new costs and protecting industries so they are still competitive in the future. That's even more of a challenge now as we come out of coronavirus, which has really exposed and exacerbated some of the existing inequalities we have in the UK. And it will have, sadly, a potentially big regional impact for some industries across the UK. Let's spread the load so the costs are spread fairly, and also the benefits, they need to be spread fairly too. And this is a moment to think carefully about unfreezing policies and making sure that we freeze them in the right way to get on track for net zero in a fair way. Jumping out from that, there are some really clear priorities that we need to focus on as we think about the post-coronavirus economy. Firstly, reskilling, retraining programs and research itself. Let's train the designers, the builders and the installers that we'll need for a low carbon future. And especially for things like low carbon heating, where we know we haven't got the installer base yet to get on track for the things that need to be done. Secondly, related to that is the big question of housing retrofits and making our new homes fit for the future. Making our homes more energy efficient is such a sensible priority coming out of this. It's a regionally spread question. We can get teams of people working on that now, and we'll see the benefits in the future. Street by street across the UK, this is a sensible step to make. We know the things that need to be done to improve energy retrofits for existing homes and to build new homes to the right standard. Thirdly is about tree planting, restoring peatlands, restoring our natural environment, and also reversing the decline that we've seen recently in our green spaces in towns and cities. We know we need more trees as a store of carbon. That's a good place to start for new opportunities and new employment chances in the future. We need more green space. We will need more peatland to be restored. Let's use that as a basis for new employment coming out of this. Fourthly, strengthening our energy networks, something so important for all energy, of course. We know we have a load of investment to do in our energy networks to grow and strengthen, especially the electricity network for the new demands we'll have in a net zero future. This is a good moment to think about that. So let's plan now to build the right networks, not just electricity networks, also heat networks, so that we're ready in the future and we can say that we use this time wisely. And lastly, an obvious thing to say, but let's make it easy as we come out of this for people to walk and cycle and to work remotely. And that means investing now in things like broadband infrastructure and investing now in using our roads differently so that we don't, in a world of social distancing coming out of this, drive people towards car use and congestion. There is a moment for that to happen, and remarkably, some of the messages we've seen from the government over the last few weeks show us that that's the way they're thinking too. So this is a really, big moment that we wouldn't have had even just a few months ago to try and change the patterns of transport use in this country and get them on track for net zero as well. My last message to you is that we still have the COP in Glasgow to look forward to. That will now happen next year. And in next year, the UK will have the presidency of the G7 summit. And that means that I think the focus we've put on climate change domestically will have resonance internationally too. So if we want to be a strong president of the G7 and of the COP next year, and such an important moment, of course, for the UK to show that international collaboration is still on the cards and can still happen after coronavirus, then I think we need to connect that with the domestic ambition on climate change. That means cutting emissions here in the UK as a means to be more effective in the presidency of these global summits next year. So everything over the course of this year and into next year is still focused on net zero, but now needs to be focused on recovering well from COVID in a pro-climate way. And if we do that, hopefully this time next year, I'll be able to speak to you directly this time and talk about how we use this time wisely to get ourselves back on track for net zero in the UK, and what a positive message that would be overall. Thanks very much.